Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we have a special bonus edition of the Talking Deen podcast looking at Turkey's Operation Peace Spring initiative, in which the Turkish armed forces have gone into northern Syria in order to dismantle and eliminate the PKK organization operating as the YPG. Today your host is Mazen Najib, that's myself. I also have Madassa Khan and Imran Malik. So we'll be discussing why did America give Turkey the green light to attack the YPG? What's the background to the entire conflict? And we'll be addressing some critical questions which are causing confusion amongst many Muslims. Many Muslims are confused as to why America has given the green light. They're confused, thinking that the PKK is just another rebel organization, as was the Free Syrian Army, or as is the Free Syrian Army, and those factions that were fighting against Assad in Syria. And therefore they are confused as to whether they should support the Turkish operation. And furthermore, some are even confused as to whether they should support Turkey, because Erdogan has initiated this attack on the PKK purely for Turkish national interest, and he did not send in the armed forces when the people in Turkey have been suffering for many years, even though he did send in the armed forces in order to protect the tomb of Suleiman Shah. So on the first question, why did America give Turkey the green light to attack the YPG?
Would you say America gave Turkey the green light, or was it, Turkey out of almost like being forced to kind of like go into Syria, considering, the threat it now kind of like faces from the YPG, or the PKK, as it was formerly known as before they kind of like relabeled themselves as YPG, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, to be more aligned with America and get that pleasant view across the world. I personally reckon America didn't give it the green light. I reckon Turkey was almost like kind of like compelled to go in there purely because its own territorial sovereignty is at stake, and also the threat now that was looming over Turkey, considering Erdogan had been trying to make a number of attempts to go in there previously when the situation was more ripe, as opposed to now, where over the past couple of years America has been arming and kind of like arming the Kurds, not the Kurds, the YPG, to a point where it does pose a significant threat to Turkey and its national interest, where it's armed them to the point of you would normally arm a state as opposed to a rebel or a small faction. We're talking, America shipping in, cargo planes, and also, truckloads, almost like there's obviously numbers being quoted and mentioned to say there was 5,000 truckloads or 1,000, cargo plane loads.
Yeah, there's 35,000 trucks and 5,000 cargo planes of weapons. So as you said, that's a huge number of weaponry. That's at a state level. And there's no way that you could give that to a rebel faction that are currently fighting in the ground, like the FSA, etc.
So that's what causes, and that should answer some of the questions for those who believe that America genuinely gave Turkish the green light, the Turkish armed forces the green light to go in and attack the PKK, just because Trump said he's given the green light and he's withdrawing. But people need to look below the surface, because America has invested heavily in the Kurdish project. They've invested heavily, as you've said, in arming the YPG, in empowering them, in supporting them, not just over the past couple of years, but the whole Kurdish project as a whole for many years now. The fact that the YPG control 80% of Syria's oil in the regions of the northeast, what they call Rojava, which is going to be the name of their Kurdish state in that region, shows that it had to be more to it than meets the eye. So there had to be something else to it.
I think the other thing is that, like Madassa said, that Turkey had no choice but to go in. The fact that the US was arming the YPG.
So why didn't they have a choice?
Well, I think Erdogan is aware that because Erdogan wanted to go into northern Syria way before it did, and it's aware that the US is also dragging its feet, and there is talk of that this is a trap set by the Americans for the Turks, that they could get into a quagmire. But I think Erdogan would be more astute into knowing that this isn't a quagmire as such, because it's got the FSA on the ground, which Turkey will obviously support by
through aerial
bombardment and support,
yeah.
And then they use the FSA and its own troops obviously to win the battle on the ground. So I think Erdogan is aware that the quagmire issue will be thwarted, or he hopes that it will be thwarted by using the FSA and the aerial support that it will give. So in also that will allow the weakening of the YPG as well.
Yeah, I think it's also important to mention the historical context of why America and Israel, for that matter, have been supporting the Kurdish project for a Kurdish independent state in northern Iraq, what they call the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government, which is like a de facto separate region of Iraq, and then in northwestern Turkey, what they call Rojava. So why has America been supporting this Kurdish project, and how does it link to the Greater Middle East Initiative?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I just want to take you back slightly is when the question that you posed, why is Erdogan compelled now? What's it linked to and the timing? There's quite a few indicators, and also has America really given it the blessings? I mean, you just have to look at, some of the circumstances that are surrounding this operation. I mean, you look at, Erdogan's own popularity is diminishing. Okay, the elections are coming up in 2 years' time, and also we know, the popularity and also the Syrian refugee issue that's on his hands, and the fact that he recently lost, key, like strongholds of the AKP, and also the fact that, the £3.6 billion funding is about to be cut, which was to say to Turkey, if you
cut from who?
The Americans, the the investment that they were given for blocking the refugees from entering Europe,
right, okay,
and housing, the Syrian refugees. So maybe Erdogan thought, okay, that's coming to an end. And also the fact that, when I said, he was almost compelled, he did make, numerous attempts to go to the Americans, where Americans were making commitments to say, okay, we'll man the border with you. But America was never coming forward to have, give anything committal financially. So it was Turkey that was having to burden the manning of the border, and some of the agreements that Turkey had made with the Americans never really came up with it. The other thing is, America can't just leave the situation being the sole superpower of the world and walk away without having real kind of influence. So hence why, if you look at some of the statements that Trump has come out with, such as, our policy is to not partake in, the stupid endless wars, which is, a common theme of the Trump regime and the promises that he made at the start. And also the fact that
he's got a re-election coming up next year.
Absolutely,
so he wins a popularity contest.
Absolutely.
Contest
then,
with that.
Similarly, on the opposite hand, he's talking and coming out with statements to say, if Turkey does anything which I consider to be off limits, I will destroy and obliterate the Turkish economy. And also the fact that then he kind of levels it out to say it's time for the others who have got the necessary role to stand up and be accountable and take charge of their own territories, or protect their own territories. So you can see where he's getting internal public pressure, and we know there's internal public pressures between the Republicans and the Democrats. So he's trying to level the ground out, but also he's kind of keeping that middle ground to ensure that American supremacy still has some kind of validity to it, without thinking that they've lost. And also we do know the Russians are quite keen because that's a strategic area which the Kurds are controlling, and it falls kind of nicely into the Russian hands, in the sense that they'll be able to use the Turks to kind of bring back a region which gives great economical benefit to both the Syrians and also the Russians. And the fact that the Astana agreement was almost like the prime of the ample template for the Turks to kind of get what they wanted, but they turned away from that and went towards the American initiatives.
On the point of Russia also, I think it's advantageous for Russia that Turkey has gone in the sense that it solidifies the relationship with Erdogan and Russia, because there was a rift between America and Turkey, that is Turkey moving away from America's orbit of influence. Then it bought the planes from the warplanes from
the S-400
from Russia, and obviously America wasn't happy with that. Also with the Russians is that they still have Idlib to sort out, because that's still one of the main strongholds for
the rebel stronghold. Yes.
So I don't know, a deal possibly could be done with Turkey and Russia, saying that you allow us to sort out the Idlib issue, and also shores up the Assad regime as well. So I think it benefits. There's a lot of players obviously in Syria. Even the EU is some of the European states have come out and criticised Erdogan. France has, Britain has, Germany, etc. But it's a bit obviously it's a complicated issue. But with the Russians, I think it favours the Russians in terms of the stance that it has in Syria, and with Erdogan as well.
And that's very true. And also, I want to address, why does Turkey feel a threat, from a Kurdish state on its borders? And I think this is the crux of the matter, which is what made Turkey react, and hence the reason why I wanted to draw it back to the Greater Middle East Initiative, which is the American plan for the region. So as a quick recap, we've discussed many times before, the Greater Middle East Initiative is America's strategy and plan for the whole Muslim world, from Morocco all the way to Pakistan, which has two main objectives. There are other sub-objectives, but the two overarching and main objectives, one is to secularize the region, secularize the Muslims and secularize Islam, and there's a whole load of initiatives going on about that. Secondly, as a backup, is to divide and fragment and subdivide the entire region across ethnic and sectarian lines as far as possible. For America, establishing a Kurdish state across northern Iraq, northern Syria, into Iran and Turkey in future was one way of not only dividing the Ummah, but the Kurdish movement, or the Kurdistan that they were looking to establish. The PKK and these movements have had a Kurdish state been successfully established in northern Syria, what they call Rojava, and unified with the KRG in Iraq. This would have become a potent force from which America would have used as a base in order to destabilize and break up Turkey by arming and inciting the millions, I think it's 40 million or so Turks, Kurds that live inside Turkey, on Turkey's southeastern border.
That's true. I mean, you mentioned, Rojava, and the Kurds between themselves, or the PKK or the YPG, they call it Western Kurdistan. And it is, I mean, if you look at, why is it such a threat to Turkey? Because Turkey probably has the biggest sizable Kurdish population out of all the countries where there is a kind of presence of Kurds, such as Iran, Syria, Iraq, etc. Now, the interesting thing is, when you mentioned, the Middle East Initiative, historically, when the Middle East Initiative, the GMEI, Great Middle East Initiative, was announced in 2004, Israel was also party to that, and it played a massive part in that. And one of the reasons that the Americans at the time kind of recognized, and they also mentioned it, and Brzezinski also kind of mentioned it, who was the security advisor and kind of shaped the American policy and foreign policy. Well, he said, between...
in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. Yes. Even recently, until he passed away, he had a massive influence.
Yeah.
And there were quite a few books written, and some of those books were also kind of adopted as key material, where they trained, their army of... I forgot the name of the place, but also Carnegie Endowment. They kind of adopted that approach as well, where they said between 1990, 1993 and 2015, the global demand for energy consumption will rise by 50%. And this was also mentioned by the US Department for Energy. And they said, the significant increase in consumption will emanate from the Far East. you can see how America wants to solidify that region where there's a Kurdish presence, because that's where untapped resources are. Containing, but at the same time, like you said, fragment the Muslim world and use an entity that can contain the Muslims in the sense that it can secularize them, and also along sectarian lines.
So the reason why the Turkish regime and the Turkish authorities had to respond to this threat was in order to maintain Turkey's own territorial integrity and security. And if we go back a few years, we find actually the threat start becoming clear to Turkey from 2012, 2013, 2014 onwards. So very early on, the threat started emerging in Turkey, because initially, we have to remember, the YPG units, which are actually the PKK, the Kurdish military organization set up and funded by America and Israel. The PKK, or its branch, the YPG, was armed by the Americans initially under the pretext that they were liberating the towns such as Ras Al Ain and Kobani. They were liberating these towns from ISIS control. So Turkey tolerated the YPG incursion into these territories because they were led to believe by the Americans that once they've liberated these from ISIS, they were going to withdraw. However, America, being America, went back on its agreement and started strengthening the YPG. And as Mudassir said early on, they have flooded that region with arms to the YPG to the level of a state, where they've got arms in the same way a state might have. So what happened? The YPG then went on a massive ethnic cleansing campaign where they demolished houses belonging to Arabs and Turkmens in northwestern Syria and start displacing them in order to Kurdify these regions in preparation for this Rojava state that they were looking to establish there. And it's a shame that the Turkish regime didn't go in sooner. But then Turkey did respond to that initially with Operation Euphrates Shield. So there was a limited operation with Euphrates Shield, but America was kept, and until now, kept stalling Turkey through drawing agreements with it. So they made an agreement with it to say that they were going to have a joint patrol over Manbij, because Erdogan was threatening to go all the way east, all the way towards Manbij. So they made an agreement with Turkey in 2017 that they were going to carry out joint patrols in Manbij in order to stop the Turkish incursion. Turkey was deceived into it and didn't carry out the operation. And in those 2 years, America continued to strengthen and flood the YPG with arms. In 2018, Turkey then went into Afrin and again was threatening to go to Manbij. And again, the Americans made an agreement with Turkey. And the Turks should have realized by now that America doesn't keep its agreements. It was just stalling them. And now by 2019, late 2019, it dawned upon Turkey that if they don't go in now, and if they were to go in later, the YPG now are a quite capable force, and they would have been a lot more easier to knock out a couple of years ago. Hence, it was inevitable they were going to go in. Donald Trump realized, as Mudassir said at the start, they're going to go in, and he therefore gave the so-called green light. And he gave the green light for two purposes. One, as has already been said, he had no choice. The Turks were to go in anyway. Had they gone in with American troops still stationed to the east of Euphrates, it would have potentially put them the American troops face to face, a couple of thousand of them face to face with the Turkish military, which is the second largest military in NATO after America. Did America want that? Of course not. Secondly, a direct confrontation would mean, as Imran said earlier, that Turkey would be totally slipping out of America's orbit, and America would lose control of Turkey altogether, which would be risking the Incirlik military base that America has. It would be risking that, and it would be pushing Turkey totally into the arms of Russia, which would turn Turkey against America altogether. Because up until now, what have been the Turkish politicians have they been saying? they keep still referring to America as an ally. They're still hoping that America will come back to them somehow.
Because, sorry to cut you off,
Yes.
the recent media coverage is that even the comments on the social media is that they actually, it's as if they're confused who their allies are. Yeah, obviously Turkey plays a big role in NATO. Yeah,
Yes.
but there's a question of should we be supporting the YPG, or should we be supporting the Turks? I think the majority of the opinion on the ground in the West, especially, is that that they should be supporting the YPG because they're the ones who fought against ISIS.
Yes.
And so there's this talk about who the allies are, but then Turkey has to keep reminding the West that we've done more for you than the actual YPG have.
Yeah.
You know, but obviously because America's got its own agenda.
Has its own agenda.
And
Remarkable.
Yeah, I mean,
and the second point, linked to that is that from America's point of view, what is America hoping? That the operation that Turkey will face in Syria, it will be prolonged. Turkey will deplete its resources, deplete its military, deplete its economy. And would America stop funding the YPG, or would they still be secretly funneling arms? Because they have the American military presence in Iraq, in Syria, in the Gulf, and the multiple channels by which they have to be funneling arms to the YPG, which includes Israel, which we'll come on to in a minute, the special relationship of Israel and the Kurdish state project going back historically. America is planning to really give Turkey a bloody nose, so to speak, in this region. So, and Turkey is hoping for a quick operation, because if it doesn't have a quick operation, it could get stuck there, just in the same way America trapped the Saudis in Yemen and made it difficult for them to extricate themselves from that situation. Yes,
I mean, you can
Madessa.
see the designs of America for Turkey. I mean, like you mentioned, it really does want to deplete Turkey financially and economically, such as, like the Americans were never favourable for Turkey to push, the refugees back into Syria, because obviously it needs to sustain them, which means it's going to cost them. The other thing is, militarily, America can still trap Turkey if it needed to. The other thing is, when we were talking about, how the Americans were arming, the Kurds to almost a state level, but we also have to recognise, the significance of that region when we say strategic. So if you look at, some of, the trade routes that go into Turkey, such as wheat and cotton, they go through that region. So economically, that's a threat to Turkey. On top of that, 80% of the Syrian oil sits within this region, which the YPG control. Now, can you imagine a group, a faction that has been armed to a state level, and on top of that, it's got, the oil revenue to finance itself? What level of threat it can pose to Turkey and its national interest? And on top of that, when you mentioned, how the Americans were stalling the Turks, so on a number of occasions, like you mentioned, the Americans did sign agreements with Turkey, but they kept on mentioning and stating that, we're here to prevent and monitor the Islamic State's comeback, as opposed to going after the Kurdish militia, which was a clear indication to the Turks that, look, America's playing delay tactics. The longer you delay it, the bigger the enemy becomes, and it obviously morphs into something that you can't really contain. And then on top of that, you've got, like I mentioned, transport routes, and also, how, linking it back to, the wider plans for the region, how they want to literally use, the YPG to dismantle, the Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, and also, threaten the unification of the Muslim countries from within. So it's no longer, America coming in, invading. It's breaking up, the Muslim nation from within by using, the YPG.
Yeah, that's some very valid points there. So, yes, quickly, so you add something to that.
The other thing I want to make note of is that we have to make a differentiation between Kurds and the YPG. Yeah, because not every Kurd supports the YPG
Or the PKK.
or PKK, so in
Yes.
fact, yeah, because the YPG and the PKK, they're ultra nationalists and non-Muslims as well. So non-religious and non-Muslims as well. Yeah, whereas majority of the Kurds, they are Muslims. Yeah, so their sentiments is with Islam and the Muslims. So that's what we have to differentiate between the YPG and the normal, the average Kurds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the whole PKK, and it naturally leads actually to the next point of discussion, which is why the PKK are unique as a movement compared to the other rebel movements, such as the Free Syrian Army and the other factions that were fighting in Syria. What is it about the PKK? Ideologically, as Marxist, Leninist, secularist, atheist, leadership of these organizations, because Turkey's operation isn't against the Kurds or the Kurdish people. In fact, you'll find plenty of film footage of when the Turkish troops went into towns like Afrin and liberated them from the YPG. It was the Kurdish residents themselves who were thanking them, because the PKK were kidnapping their children, training them and forcing them to take part in their Peshmerga military units. So, I mean, if we know that when the PKK took over, and one of the brothers sent me a translation of an Arabic article in which it said that when the PKK first took over Ras Al Ain, the first thing they did was to go to the great mosque of Ras Al Ain, and they, from the pulpit, they were shouting at the loudspeakers to the residents of Ras Al Ain, who they thought were supporting the Free Syrian Army and the other Islamic factions there that are fighting Assad. You know what they were shouting? Where are you, dogs of Muhammad? This was their first, message to the people of Ras Al Ain. Where are you, O dogs of Muhammad? Calling the Muslims, and the Arabs of that region. And after that, they began to seize the shops and homes of the people and force them out, and they carried out huge crimes. And they repeated this pattern across the entire region, as I mentioned earlier, as part of their ethnic cleansing. Kurdish people who are Muslim and Islamic, they reject the PKK. And even in Turkey, you'll find that within the armed forces, there are Kurds who are taking part in the operations against the PKK because their loyalty is with Islam. And their perception is that Erdogan's an Islamic leader, so which is a separate story. But what it does confirm that the nature of the PKK is totally different to these other factions. But there's more to them as well. Imran, yes, you want to say something?
Yeah, I've just said, even historically, even before modern day Turkey, when the Uthmani state was in existence, the Kurds had a very good relationship with the state.
Yes.
And even though it was a semi-autonomous area,
yes,
but they still paid lip service to the sultans and the caliphs.
They swore allegiance to the caliph, and that was the region that was the most opposition, represented the most opposition to Ataturk for keeping the Islamic State and their loyalty to Istanbul. So, fantastic point there.
And it's only when the Young Turks came in and they rebelled and they were politically against Sultan Abdul Hamid that these kind of sentiments started to gain prominence. But before that, the notion of a separate Kurdish nation was very, very minute. It didn't exist.
Yes.
But after World War One, when the Russians and the Armenians, they actually massacred the Kurds, but they put a good resistance.
Yes.
But then obviously within you get traitors, and then they fought well against they fought very heroically in Dardanelles and also the Gallipoli also. But in the when the Russians and the Armenians massacred the Kurds, there was I think his name was Sharif Pasha. He's the one who went and signed an agreement at the Paris Peace Conference with the Armenians that you support us gain independence and we'll aid you.
So this is where the PKK was effectively born.
That's right, yeah. And also the British caught wind of this, and then the major who was in charge at that time of the area, Major EWC Noel, he tried winning the Kurds over, just like Lawrence Arabia did in the Arab Revolt. So against pitting the Kurds against the Turks. What we see as a GMEI was actually existence back then, but in a different format or a style.
So that was almost like the birth of the Sykes-Picot and its implementation across the Muslim world.
Yeah.
And then after that, after the demise of the Uthmani Khilafah, that's when the this Kurdish state became more prominent.
Yeah, and
It didn't exist before.
Yeah, some very good points, and the main modern day Kurdish movement was actually born after the Second World War. So the modern independence movement was born after the Second World War, and its founding father is considered as Mullah Mustafa Barzani, the father of the current Barzani, who's the president of the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. And it's well on record that this movement, independence movements from Mullah Mustafa Barzani, right from the beginning, had ties to Israel, and it was an Israeli project. And it's no wonder then in 2017, when the Kurds were organizing an independence referendum in northern Iraq, Benjamin Netanyahu, he was the only world leader to openly declare his support for an independent Kurdish state. But that's not a secret, because it was and then when the referendum was voted as yes, then you found in the entire region Kurdish flags were being flown alongside Israeli flags openly and unashamedly. And Barzani said that he was not averse to having open ties with Israel under the pretext that all the Arab regimes have that. But with this Kurdish independence movement, it's a lot more sinister, because Barzani, he visited Israel in the 60s to ask the then Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion for support. So we find that the Israelis, right from the start, have had an interest in the Kurdish project, and it goes back even historically, because a lot of Kurdish Jews emigrated to Israel in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but 40s and 50s in particular, and they were the bridge between the Israelis and this independence movement there. So no wonder in 2004, Seymour Hersh, he published some details of how actually the Israelis, through Mossad and other military units, had a major presence in northern Iraq directly after America's invasion of Iraq. And Seymour Hersh is the same guy who exposed the crimes of the Americans in Abu Ghraib, for your information. And at that time, the Israelis were denying that they had military units on the ground in northern Iraq and had a military presence there. But in 2006, the BBC Newsnight programme, which you can look up, they actually uncovered evidence which showed the Israelis there training the Kurdish PKK and KDP fighters in northern Iraq.
I mean, even if anyone does have any question marks around, whether this is true or not, or whether it's just a conspiracy, I mean, you just have to look at the events on the ground. So, for example, when Condoleezza Rice launched the Great Middle East Initiative in 2004, it was also, part of the plans to draw in Israel and make it kind of like shape the region and plant this alien entity within Syria. And at the time, the Israelis and the Americans called it the campaign between wars. And the key primary objective of that was to erode Iranian and other Muslim nation, capabilities, and also deplete Syria from of its resource and economic benefits.
Yeah.
And then also, to implant an intelligence and strategic capability within the region.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it was only in 2018 when the Russians offered the Israelis a deal to say, look, we'll man the border for you. They're talking about, borders within and areas within Syria. Why would you make a deal or try to offer something when the Israelis have no interest or have no presence within that region? And then the Israelis, even most recently, when Trump said we're going to go out and the Turkish army decided to go in there, they were one of the first ones to voice concerns about having Turkish troops within Syria.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so right now, the Israelis were extremely vocal about Turkey's operation in northern Syria because it destroys their plans, for that. And Seymour Hersh, he was quoting a Mossad agent who was operating in that area, in which he described that a Kurdish state, would be a threat to Iran because Iran, does not want, quote, an Israeli land-based aircraft carrier on its border.
Yeah, and don't forget...
So I think we need to just pause on that for a moment and think about it. The Israelis are openly admitting their vested interest in this Kurdish state in the heart of the Middle East. Hence why it's actually known by a lot of Muslims in that region that these guys want to establish not a Kurdistan but a Yehudistan because it actually would be an extension of Israel in the Middle East, right in a strategic location cutting across Turkey, Iran, Syria and Iraq. Can you imagine that?
And this is, it also falls into, the wider plans in regards to the deal of the century. How do you normalise ties with the Israelis? This is another angle that you can look at it from as well. So you've got the president of the Israelis. Imagine the American plans for deal of the century are successful. This would not become, something that would stand out as something which is alien for the Muslims. It would almost be something which is normal. Israeli presence within the Muslim region, which they are trying to obviously make sure that kind of ferments and materializes. And the other thing, don't forget, it was the Israelis that shot down, the Russian cargo plane in Syria. How did the Israelis manage to shoot
a Russian cargo plane or fighter jet?
No, cargo plane. They shot down, and in return, what Russia did was it gave Assad and S-300 surface-to-air missiles to ensure something like that doesn't happen. And they complained that there was no coordination between the Russians, the Israelis, and the Americans in relation to this. Why would the Israelis shoot down a Russian cargo plane? And I think about 15 Russian personnel got killed.
Why would they?
Sorry?
Why would they? What's the answer to that question?
Why would they? This just goes to show that if anyone can disputes the fact that there's no Israeli presence in there and it's not
I think it's beyond that point now. Really, to be honest, it's not even a secret. So the fact is well documented that Mustafa Barzani went straight to Israel, and he's a founding father of the modern Kurdish independence movement. The KDP, which is the separatist movement in northern Iraq, and then the PKK, which is its equivalent in northern Syria and in southern Turkey. These movements and their links to Israel are clear. And as we said, just in the 2017 election, but even prior to that, do you know in the 1990s, it's on record that the Israelis were supplying the Kurds then in Iraq at the time then as well. It's also on record that in the 90s, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, they had a strong relationship with the Kurdish movement, and they even officially acknowledged that by providing aid to the Kurds back in 1980, when Prime Minister of Israel then, Begin, disclosed that Israel had supported the Kurds during their uprising against the Iraqis between 65 and 75. So you can see Israeli arms have been flooding in since the 60s into that region, right from the start. And furthermore, there was the Israeli Kurdish Friendship League, which was established in Jerusalem. And can you imagine the Israeli newspaper, Israel National News? They actually said, and I'm quoting, Israel would do well to eye Rojava with interest, and not only to confront Iran's penetration. He said, or the article stated, Rojava and Iraqi Kurdistan are the only entities in the Middle East, apart from Israel, that enjoy open, secular and liberal rule, granting considerable rights to the opposition, women and minorities. So they are openly declaring that ideologically, Israel and the Kurdish independence movement is directly aligned intellectually. And furthermore, just one point before you come in, Imran, was to link to what Mudassir said earlier. that strategically, the same article was saying that should Israel strengthen its relationship with the Syrian Kurds, its gains would extend beyond strategic, political and security benefits. Rojava's natural resources. Remember, we already said that the PKK controls 80% of Syria's oil reserves in that region. And here the Israeli newspaper is saying that Rojava's or northwest Syria's natural resources, especially its oil, can contribute to Israel's energy supply and be invested in projects such as an oil pipeline through Jordan. And goes on to say that US troops are stationed at 7 military bases in Rojava, and that could offer an alternative to the Turkish military base, should it come to get to the point where Turkey expels the military base. So you see the Israeli connection, historically until now, just cannot be undermined or diminished, which would explain Israel's current displeasure with the Turkish operation in northern Syria. Yes, Imran?
Yes, hence why, like you're saying, they're angry, because the fact that it reduces their influence in that part of Syria. But the ideological threat that the YPG and the PKK poses in the heart of Muslim is very, very dangerous. The fact that they're Marxist, atheists, secularists, this all is attack against Islam and the Aqidah of the Muslims.
And this newspaper article from the Israeli journal is confirming it, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So this wishful thinking that this Kurdistan will provide prosperity to individuals or people, Kurds or whatever, it's not going to be beneficial for the Muslims in the long run, because it's a direct attack on Islam and their core principles.
Absolutely, and that can't be stressed enough. So the fact they see it as an ideological base, they see they see a Kurdish state as being an extension of Israel. The fact that they see it as being an Israeli land-based aircraft carrier in that region, these are their own terms for it, shows you that fighting the PKK and eliminating the PKK is as good as eliminating Israel.
And that's obviously the difference between your average, normal rebel factions on the ground compared to the YPG.
Correct.
Because the rebel factions, they wanted freedom and independence from Bashar al-Assad, yeah. Whereas the YPG and the KDP, sorry,
the YPG,
yeah.
which is the PKK undercover,
So they're completely different kettle of fish compared to the rebel factions that are fighting.
Absolutely, yeah. So there is no comparison whatsoever. So you're right. A lot of these movements, they were sincere. They were sincere, but they were manipulated and deceived into believing that they were going to be free from Assad in the same way the people of Libya had just become free from Gaddafi. So the West deceived the Syrians into believing that they would come to their support and get rid of Assad in the same way that they had just carried out airstrikes in 2011 in Libya and destroyed Libya and removed Gaddafi. And the people believed it. But the West had no intention of removing Assad, but their intention was to get a civil war going. But with the PKK, they knowingly and deliberately are an extension of Israel and the Israeli project and America. And you can find videos online with Israeli officials visiting northern Iraq, celebrating with the Kurdish independence movements. And I posted a video earlier on my Facebook page in which you don't understand Arabic, but you can hear Yahudi, Kurdi, Israeli alliance, and there are Israeli representatives at this rally.
For those that do understand Kurdish, it'd be really worthwhile for them to actually listen to that video and understand exactly what they are saying to, because it's easier and it's more believable if you hear it in your own kind of like language. The other question is, a lot of the people do question that, okay, we're talking about the situation, Operation Peace Spring. Is it really right for us to kind of like support the military action, considering, Turkey, and as we've spoken, okay, we understand, the position that is held by America, Israel, as well as the YPG, and also Turkey for that reason, due to nationalistic and patriotic reasons, is it really right for us to support it from an Islamic perspective, from an Ummah's perspective? I mean, what's your views? Because that's one of the, seems to be the main point of discussion on, you know, social media platforms at the moment.
I mean, like I mentioned before, if it's an ideological threat to the Muslims, it's better to have that entity removed, which is a threat to Islam and the Muslims. So even though Erdogan doesn't represent Islam in its entirety, but at least the action that he's undertaking, or the army is undertaking, to remove the harm that it will bring the Muslims, in that sense, it is beneficial for the Muslims. But don't be fooled, because Erdogan is no Khalif or Sultan at the same time. Yeah, he's a national.
And had he been, he would have taken this action earlier. He would have annexed the whole of Syria when he had the opportunity easily back in 2011, 2012.
So the main issue is what benefits the Muslims and what removes the harm for the benefits for the Muslims from an ideological perspective. Like we mentioned before, Marxists, communist ideas about liberation for women, freedoms, etc. These are all an attack on Islam and the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, why else would he openly, ally with Israel, and the Jews, and be prepared to be an extension of Israel? Hence the reason why a Kurdish state would be a Zionist state. It would be an extension of Israel.
Absolutely, and the other key point not to forget is, as an Ummah, we should be looking at everything through the lenses of, being politically savvy and being politically aware. And let's not forget, that anything which kind of supports or disrupts the American and the Kuffar plans within the region, we should always support those, whether it's obviously done by Turkey or someone else. So that's the other angle, because anything which kind of threatens the unity of the Ummah and creates more quagmire and perpetuates the situation, you should always be against it. But at the same time, like you mentioned, what benefits the Ummah far outweighs whether it's Turkey, whether it's someone else or not.
Yeah, so the issue isn't who is disrupting this Israeli-American project and eliminating the PKK. The issue is exactly as you have pointed out. The issue is that now that we know the reality of the Kurdish independence movement, its history and origins, of how from the 50s and 60s it was born in alliance with Israel. It's not just a spontaneous movement which was accidentally encouraged, as the other rebel factions were, deceptively, as we said. Now we know what this movement's about. Now we know its ideological objectives are aligned to, in its war against Islam and facilitating and aiding the enemies of Islam directly. So the elimination of the PKK, therefore, is directly equivalent to the elimination of Israel from a Muslim perspective. So now, if Turkey right now is engaged in a major operation against Tel Aviv and Haifa and all the other Jewish population centers of Israel, and Israel was on the verge of destruction, which Muslim would come out and say, hey, wait, Erdogan's not the Khalif. Hey, wait, Turkey's doing this for its own personal interest. They're not doing it for Islamic reasons. Okay, that might be the case. Does that mean now you oppose and you want to preserve Israel? You want to keep Israel there now and prolong its existence and protect it, in effect? Which is the equivalent of what people would be advocating for the PKK, which I think most people are, because of their ignorance. They don't understand the reality of the Kurdish independence movement. So the issue, as we said right from the start, isn't about Turkey versus the Kurdish people. It's not. Whenever a conspiracy against the Ummah and Islam is being disrupted by anyone, even if their intention was totally different, should the Muslims rejoice or should we be sad? And should they rejoice whether they're Arabs or Turks or Kurds or Pakistanis? Is it a national issue or is it an ideological issue? Through these actions and through the elimination of the PKK, inshallah, it's a major setback for the Greater Middle East Initiative. It's a great setback for the Israeli entrenchment of establishing its land-based aircraft carrier, as they call it themselves, right in the heart of the Middle East. So, and the answer is clearly there should be rejoicing. And in the same way, when we look at Syria and we say that the Jews in Yathrib, they indirectly facilitated and assisted the birth of the Islamic State in Medina. Okay, they didn't do it intentionally. They didn't do it because they wanted the Messenger ﷺ to be successful and Islam to prevail. They did it with other intentions. I want to recap this for the listeners in case people are wondering what the hell I'm talking about. When the Messenger ﷺ in the 10th year of his message was struggling after the death of his uncle Abu Talib and the oppression increased, and he started carrying now the dawah to people from outside Mecca, and he met 6 people from Yathrib. And these 6 people of Yathrib, when he said to them, I'm the messenger of Allah, and gave dawah to them, straight away they start to think about embracing Islam, and they embraced Islam. And do you know what they said? They said, this is the same messenger that the Jews have been threatening us with. Because the Jews, whenever they used to get angry with the Arabs in Yathrib, they used to always threaten them, saying, our Messiah, our messenger is coming, and when he comes he will unify us, and we will have victory over you Arabs.
So effectively dismantled their kind of like plans.
The Jews themselves dismantled their own plans and facilitated and assisted the birth and the spread of Islam in Yathrib, to the extent that within 2 years a popular base had been born and it was ready now to base a state. Now we rejoice at the fact that this breakthrough came and it backfired on the Jews themselves. So if we could rejoice at that, why could we not rejoice at the fact that there are Muslim soldiers in the Turkish army who have an Islamic spirit of some type, who are dismantling a Jewish conspiracy, an Israeli Zionist conspiracy, an American conspiracy.
Which kind of enforces, kufr ideas amongst the Ummah. So obviously, and also dismantling the espionage hotbed as like one of also.
The PKK being the hotbed of this espionage and kufr.
I mean, we're saying all this, then can't you argue that a lot of the people might turn around and say, yeah, but this is a bit hypocritical, considering the fact that you guys are quite vocal in regards to Turkey's actions, but then why weren't you so vocal in regards to Assad when he was trying to obviously do something and targeting certain rebel factions, etc. So how does this fare with what Turkey is doing and what Assad was trying to do? Is it similar? Is it different?
It's a very good question.
It can come across as very hypocritical.
It's a very good question, and I think we'd have to first differentiate between the two circumstances. The whole Assad situation and the Syrian civil war was engineered by America, and the Ummah was deceived into believing that these were spontaneous revolutions, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, and from there they caught on in Libya and Syria and Yemen and all these other places. And this was part of the deception that mobilized the Ummah in order to create the fitna which occurred in these lands. And the Muslims in Syria were given false hope, as I explained, after the West gave them false hope in making them believe that they were going to support them against Assad to bring him down. And then that led to all these rebel factions who were all being funded and financed by foreign states, directly or indirectly, in order to which fuel the fitna. And a fitna is described as when the situation isn't blatantly clear on which side you should take place. You might say, okay, with Assad it's very clear. With Assad and the Alawites it's very clear. But most of the forces on the ground that were doing the fighting were Muslim. And it was turning out to be a Sunni Shia civil war, which is what America was planning, to embed this deep sectarian divide across the entire region by using its tools. So Hezbollah is an American tool. They use the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a part of its plan. They used all these other Islamic groups which were being funded by Qatar and Saudi and these kind of regimes, which were directed by America. But these factions on the ground and the people fighting these grounds and their leaderships, most of them were sincere, but they had been politically deceived into believing that they could overthrow Assad. But they couldn't do, because America would never ever give them sufficient weapons in order for them to overthrow Assad. They never did provide them any kind of support to bring down Assad as they had done with Gaddafi. What America was doing was supplying enough weapons in order to maintain a stalemate situation, to perpetuate a civil war. With the PKK, they have been they actually are an arm. They should be seen as an equivalent to Israel. The PKK, the YPG, the KDP, the whole Kurdish independence movement from Mustafa Barzani's time in the 60s is known to be an Israeli project where they deliberately and knowingly are a part of it. Did any of the leaders of these other rebel factions, did they go to Israel right from the start in the 60s? And these was movements which were created and spontaneously came about. Well, they didn't spontaneously came about. America engineered their creation and then just fueled the civil war. And overthrowing Bashar Assad was now to regime change. And we know that regime change is not the method of Islam to change a regime. But America had given this false hope to the people that he could bring out this regime change through armed struggle, to the point where even Islamic political movements, or so they claim to be political movements, even they became deceived to take part in the armed struggle in order to overthrow Assad. But America wasn't going to allow it, because this was being controlled by America. With the PKK, this is very clearly a munkar, an evil, and removal of munkar and evil depends upon capability. So it's a duty, it's an obligation to fight the PKK. Doesn't mean that we're asking any individuals to go over there and fight the PKK, because they won't have the capability. But the armed forces of a state, such as the Turkish state, the Pakistani state, or the Iranian state, and the armed forces and the people in these armed forces and their capacities as Muslims, do they have the capability? So do we not call upon the armed forces to rebel against the regimes and take their own initiative and attack Israel? And why do we do that? Because it's linked to capability. There are separate obligations. I think people need to understand. Establishing the Islamic State is one obligation, but removing a munkar is another obligation. Defensive jihad, which is not dependent upon the presence of a state, is another obligation. But all these obligations are linked to capability. So when the Messenger ﷺ says, if anyone sees any munkar, let him change it with his hand. And if he can't, let him change it with his tongue. And then if he can't, let him change it or hate it in his heart. This is linked to capability. So changing it with the hands is the link to capability. So any entity or person which has the capability to remove a munkar, they must. So when we call upon the armed forces of the Muslim world to remove Israel, we do so on the basis that they are Muslims and they have the capability to remove this munkar, and it's an obligation upon them. Now that Erdogan has mobilized the Turkish armed forces in order to protect national interests of Turkey, in order to dismantle the PKK, the intention is not correct. But the result of the Muslims who are dismantling this conspiracy and removing this munkar, is this something which we should oppose or support? That's the key issue. That's how I would address that. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, even the start of the so-called Syrian revolution, people didn't go fight with the regime. They were just protesting those who wanted reforms.
Correct. Yeah.
But then the regime themselves, they got heavy-handed with the with the general population.
Yes.
And then after that, all of a sudden, you had weapons coming in.
And that's the question. Who's bringing in these weapons?
And then you had these fighters coming in all of a sudden. Where are these fighters coming from? Where were they being shipped from? Obviously, it was external players who were factors and actual players who were actually
facilitating. Even here in Europe, the European governments were facilitating all these people who later on they were now they're deriding,
their citizenship, etc.
Yeah. So to start off with, it was a peaceful protest, But now we see today it's pure carnage, total chaos.
Yeah.
That Syria has become so demolished and just obviously just been wiped off the earth. What is left is just the the borders. There's no infrastructure at all.
Yeah.
And who's facilitating all this is the colonialists, mainly America and Israel, who allowed it. And they've even the Daesh, ISIS, the fighters who were in certain areas which were in control of the regime. They were actually shipped to different areas, different parts of Syria, so they could continue fighting in other parts of the country.
Absolutely. I mean, even the demographics of the whole region were being kind of like changed and manipulated. So people might accuse, Turkey of trying to Arabize, the Kurdish region, which the Kurds initially did exactly the same thing.
They Kurdified him.
Absolutely, under the guise of American protection, etc., and the fact that they were trying to remove ISIS. And it's quite an interesting and unique point as well. I mean, it kind of like also kind of like states that, why do we keep on falling into this trap consistently? Is there any particular reasons? I mean, even though, like Turkey's done this, it's not just about, we keep on talking about, states and nations, etc. But the Ummah, what we've just kind of like discussed here, is it falls into these, traps repeatedly. And why does it fall into these traps repeatedly? Is it because we view something from a particular lens or through a particular binoculars, or is it just the fact that the situation is so complex?
Yeah, so before to answer that question, so I just really want to clarify on the previous question, which is people say Turkey attacking the PKK is equivalent to Assad attacking the Free Syrian Army or other rebel factions. It's not clearly the same thing. As we've said, with PKK is a specific entity, and that's the dismantling of a foreign conspiracy. Assad attacking these rebel factions, Imran explained very well how these rebel factions came into existence, because the people were just protesting. They were holding up banners asking, for the downfall of Assad, asking for elections and democracy or freedom, and some people were asking for some kind of Islamic a flavour of this, and then weapons start flooding in and armed factions, and the population wasn't taking part in it. It was foreign fighters, so it was engineered that way. So Assad is now fighting these factions which he was made to fight, because initially there was no civil war. Yes, the Syrian regime is known to be heavy-handed. It's not the first time. The Syrian regime has been heavy-handed for the last 30, 40 years, since Hafiz Assad's time, since 1970. So there was no civil war then, nor was it justified that armed method was legitimate for regime change. But all of a sudden it became legitimate now, because America created the environment and trapped us into that. Going back to your question, which is very important, why do Muslims keep falling in these political traps? So why is it? And the fact that Muslims are confused, and I would say the answer is because Muslims, it goes back to our bread and butter. They lack the political awareness. So the fact that people were confused and they genuinely believed that America was approving Turkish action against the YPG, it's because they weren't reading beneath the surface. They just believe whatever the media is telling them. They've just been told America's giving them the green light, but they should have at least stopped and said, hang on, America might have given them the green light, but at the same time, there's this huge debate, of why are we abandoning our allies? Why are the YPG in the position that they are in? Why are they so heavily armed, as they are? And the fact that America has been stalling Turkey for the last 2 or 3 years from going in there. So why now? You've got to start thinking a bit more deeply. And unfortunately, Muslims don't do that. And if they had done that, they wouldn't have ended up supporting this American project and believed that there were actual blessed revolutions taking place, and they were going to ride the American wave to establish the Khilafah.
And it's also a lesson for Turkey as well, considering on its own borders. I mean, if you look at the situation of the Arab Spring or the Great Middle East Initiative, every single nation which America supported historically, or the tyrant leaders that it supported historically, they were dismantled and destroyed. Yet Turkey was still trying to aid America, and that obviously again kind of like proves the point that Turkey, it still hasn't really escaped from the orbit of the Americans, even though it wants to. But it feels entrapped purely because it has that non-ideological basis, and it's quite it's not just
I think the point you're making is very good, because you need to differentiate. There's a lack of political awareness amongst the Muslims and the Ummah, which means you'll keep getting deceived. What you're describing now is very important, because it shows that even a state, if it's non-ideological, such as the Turkish one and the Turkish regime, politically it's been maneuvered and trapped, and had it gone in, had it at an ideological basis, it would have done things differently.
Absolutely. I mean, similar. I mean, at the state level and also, at the individual level, it seems to be a similar kind of like track record, and this is what we as, an Ummah needs to do. Raise that, political awareness and also our own political understanding to ensure that, we can also kind of like clarify the Islamic Aqidah and preserve, what Islam has given us, to ensure that we never fall for these kind of like traps and plots again.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to mention is that until the Muslims don't make their belief, their Islamic Aqidah, their reference point, because at the end of the day, Islam is both spiritual and political, we know what the spiritual side of things are, but that's where we're lacking on the political side of things. So, for example, the massacre, the civil war that's been happening in Syria, has been going for years now, and how many people have tried different actions to solutions to try to resolve the issue, but the issue is still the same. Nothing's changed. It's probably getting worse. So we have to link our actions back to our basic fundamentals, which is our Islamic Aqidah. And then once we do that, that's when we will realize that our path to salvation is actually easier than it is at the moment, because the Muslims are being pulled left, right, and center. There's a million and one ways to possibly solve a political problem, be it protests, demonstrations, right to your MP or whatever. But there's only one solution which Allah has given us, and that change, in order to change society, our thinking, is also one as well, in terms of following the method of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, how we change society. What he tried in Mecca and what he did in Medina.
And this political awareness, it starts with adopting the mission of the messenger to make Islam prevail, over the whole world, the purpose of which the messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was sent. Had the Turkish regime, had Erdogan actually been an Islamic leader, and if it was an ideological state, if Turkey had been an ideological state, they would have right from the start gone in and annexed as much territory of Syria as possibly they could have under the pretext of national security. The people of Aleppo, they would have welcomed them. They would have, and bear in mind, just shortly before the Syrian civil war started, or about the same time, Russia just annexed Crimea and organised a referendum there, and that became a province of Russia.
Without anyone's consultation.
Turkey had the best opportunity because of the independence, Kurdish threat. It had the excuse of national security, and then in order to protect the civilians of Aleppo from the bombardment of the regime, it would have taken over those areas, organised a referendum quickly, and the overwhelming number of people in the entire region would have voted to become a province of Turkey, and that would have been now in motion, and that would have set a whole host of chain reaction events which would have disrupted America's plan for the entire Muslim world. But you've got to be an ideological leader to do that, and it's the ideology of Islam that gives you that kind of vision, and that gives you that kind of courage to carry out, and the impetus in order to carry out these high-stake, high-risk maneuvers, which is historically what the Muslims did from the time of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam all the way until recent times, when Muslims always carried out high-risk, high-stake strategies and always overturned the tables on our enemies.
Even when the odds were far greater than what we find ourselves in now.
Absolutely, we had far less numbers.
Because I see Yarmouk with Saladin Ayyubi under the entrapment of the Mongols at the time. I mean, the other thing you mentioned, Crimea. I mean, a better example that comes to mind in regards to the Russians is when they went into Georgia, a NATO ally. They dismantled the country into two and took the region that they wanted to take under their own, umbrella.
Yeah,
that's the thing. See, to break away from the shackles of the colonialists, a state is linked. A non-ideological state is always going to be linked or controlled by someone else.
Foreign.
But what makes a state? It's the individuals, it's the people within that state that make a state. The state isn't an empty kind of eggshell or whatever. You know what I mean? It's what consists within it, and what consists within it is the people within that. So the people have to change within themselves in order for them to become independent, to have some sort of aspiration, some goals, objectives in life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so I think that's so to wrap up then. To summarise, hopefully this has been beneficial to the listeners, to give them some more information and a wider and a different perspective to view the current situation. And in conclusion, the Muslims must increase their political awareness. The Muslims, it doesn't mean that the Turkish regime is correct or we support the Turkish regime. What we support is right, and what we reject and what we rebuke is clearly what is falsehood and contradicts Islam. So what Sharia approves of, we must support. What Sharia rejects, we must also reject. So we do rebuke the Turkish regime for being a secular nationalistic regime, for not implementing Islam. Further rebuke it for not having gone into Syria to the aid of its brethren a lot earlier, and it's only now reacting in order to preserve its own territorial integrity. But the action they are taking right now, which is disrupting a major American-Israeli project, is something which all Muslims have to support, because it's an obligation to remove the munkar. And it is being removed by the armed forces on the ground who are Muslims, regardless of what the motives are of its leaderships. And in conclusion, and to reiterate actually, that this conspiracy that's being foiled is a Kurdish independence movement which was born with Israeli cooperation right from the start in the 60s. The KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party in Iraq, the PKK, which in Turkey, and the YPG, which is a PKK rebranded, and they've also America also branded them as the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, to give them that legitimacy and support. So, Jazakallah khair for the audience listening. Jazakallah khair to Mudassir Khan and Imran Malik in joining me in addressing this very important topic at short notice. I'm Mazhar Najib, your host for today, and inshallah until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.